Zelensky, I believe, is a pawn in the political military chessboard, so that he may think that he is a very big wheel, but is merely a cog in that wheel. He has given Europe the opportunity to use the war as an excuse rather than a reason to propagate this free world thing. The Russian-Ukrainian war is one that continues to preoccupy international community. It does so because its implications are not confined to Russia and Ukraine. But in order to understand the present, there is wisdom in giving a historical context. And that context must necessarily start from the year 1989 and 1990, when the Berlin Wall collapsed and when the Soviet Union, as we knew it then, collapsed, leading to the emergence of the Russian Federation. And we remember so very vividly during that period, during the presidency of Bush I, when meetings were held in order to determine the status not only of East Germany, but the former states of the Soviet Union. And specifically at the time when the Warsaw Pact was being dissolved. Of course, a lot of Western commentators will now deny that certain promises were made, but meetings were held. We know meetings were held in Malta, which involved some of the key players at that time, Samuel Baker, who was the Foreign Secretary of the United States, and Edward Shevardnadze, who was the Foreign Minister of Russia at that time, and one may say Soviet Union, during the transition. And of course, the meetings were also held, and Gunther, I think at that time, who was the Foreign Minister of Germany, and promises are understood to have been made. And Baker is on record, not documented, some say, that there would be not a single 1-inch movement of NATO to the east. And in the case of Poland, it was said that Poland would never join NATO. And in the specific case of Ukraine, there is the famous speech, which we now know was actually written by Condoleezza Rice and read by George Bush, which was christened Chicken Kiev, which was delivered in Kiev, in which George Bush told the Ukrainians who are annoyed that they should avoid what he called excessive nationalism. It is in that context that you must therefore, or we must therefore understand the Russian disdain and distaste for what is seen as a Western Europe that is reneging on that promise. So that when Russia sees some of its former allies getting sucked into the European Union and sucked into NATO, they see Poland go, they see Estonia and Latvia go, they see the threat of Georgia go, and they see Ukraine in our neighborhood going. The very first act in the year 2014 is to get into Crimea, because you don't want NATO to be in your doorstep. And then you see other activities taking place, Donbass. And what do you see? You see a NATO that is expanding in a manner of speaking on a daily basis, and you see that this is an act which is designed to undermine Russia and ultimately to ensure that NATO dominance is created in the entire Europe. And therefore, when we talk about the current situation, that historical context must not be lost. When, therefore, the Russian administration hears that Ukraine wants to join NATO, the reaction was, you cannot join NATO. At that time, we hear people making suggestions, says, retain a neutral status. don't be NATO, don't be allied to Russia, but for God's sake, don't get into the European Union, don't get into NATO. The administration of President Zelensky holds a different view, that our people want to go into Europe and nobody is going to stop us. And that is what then triggers the war. And the memories of Crimea, which happened in 2014, are still alive and well and raw in the year 2022. And the Russians, from what we know and read, go into Ukraine thinking that this is a very short, sharp military operation that is going to neutralize these individuals and going to make them to make the right decision being that they will not join NATO. But on the other side, what in the view of many commentators emerges is that Europe sees this as an opportunity to confront the Russian Federation. And very quickly, what was essentially to be a conflict between Russia and Ukraine becomes a proxy war. And there is no doubt there is a proxy war, because we know that almost all European nations, without exception, there may be one or two, are then saying, we are supporting Ukraine. And they are supporting Ukraine with everything except boots on the ground. The Biden administration in the United States, of course, is also reading from the same script. And Russia is now confronting the entire Western world. And perhaps this is not the right phrase to use, but it's almost as if another Operation Barbarossa, as was prosecuted during the World War II in 1939, is taking place. And the West then begins to lionize Zelensky. He is our man. He is the man who is fighting the Russians and demonstrating that Russia can actually be defeated. And this ensures that Ukraine become more entrenched in their position, even saying that they will not negotiate with Russia. And you hear from the United States of America, you hear from countries such as France, and even the United Kingdom say that this particular exercise can be concluded with military victory over Russia. And that is the position in which we find ourselves until there is a change of administration in the United States of America. And that change is so dramatic because it is not only the rhetoric that changes, but Trump, even before he is sworn in as the President of the United States of America, says, when I become the president, upon being sworn in, the war will be concluded. So that is the new thing happening in the scenario, which also energizes Russia. President Putin says, yes, we like what we are hearing. We are prepared to ensure that we have peace, but peace on whose terms? And you remember that there have been quite a number of attempts at mediating or midwifing a peace process. I remember from the African continent, there is the attempt by President Cyril Ramaphosa, which is an attempt to mediate that peace. I know that there is an attempt from Indonesia by President Subianto Prabowo. There is also an attempt from Saudi Arabia. But the real attempt is with Donald Trump. And when on the 28th day of February, the year 2025, President Zelensky is invited in the Oval Office, he comes to the Oval Office a lion, a champion. He's been lionized by Europe. And he is going to the United States of America and there are commentators who say this or that about how President Trump behaved, how President Zelensky behaved, but I think he misread the situation. The United States of America is still the United States of America, a military power which you cannot ignore. And when you go to their home and you appear to be fighting their president will fight back, and there is a meltdown. And that meltdown sees President Zelensky leaving immediately to London. The European powers now know, because President Trump has said, you've got to pay your bills. We are not going to pay your bills in NATO. He's telling them we must have peace. And I remember during that meltdown, President Trump telling Zelensky, you are toying with the Third World War. You are toying with Third World War. Twice, he tells him. And I think when Zelensky goes to London, the urgent meeting of the European powers, he is torn down. Of course, Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, still wants to appear as if the United Kingdom is that kingdom which was a colonizer, and says, we are prepared to have our planes in the air and our boots on the ground. But we embrace peace. In the intervening period before that, we must never forget that the United States of America have also initiated something, and we have seen Foreign Minister Lavrov has already met the Russians in Jeddah in Saudi Arabia. And a process is going on, and the Europeans are saying, how can you discuss Ukraine without Ukraine? But the beauty of it now is that immediately after the London meeting, there is reflection. And that reflection is what sees the writing of the letter by Zelensky, which is then read by President Trump when he is addressing the joint houses of Congress. And he says, I'm happy now. Zelensky also wants peace. So we are speaking at a time when peace is the mantra. Everybody wants peace. But what are the terms of the peace? This is what I think the world is now grappling with. Are we going to have that peace at a time when the one side, that is Ukraine, is saying we've got to go back to the borders prior to 2014, which means Russia returns, so to speak, Crimea to Ukraine, which means Donetsk and Luhansk and the other territories must return to Ukraine. I hear some say, Mark Rubio and others saying, that may not happen. You've got to consider making some territorial concessions. So we are speaking at a time when the terms of the peace have not been settled. The Europeans under Keir Starmer have said, we are working out on the terms of that peace. And he is putting together what he calls a coalition of the willing. And in that coalition of the willing, we are going to send it to the United States of America and see what they say. But remember that even within the European Union, there are voices that are saying we are not going to cast our vote with the rest of Europe. Hungary is speaking that, so that there is no harmony. And I think that is why Keir Starmer says it is a coalition of the willing. And the two loud voices are France and the United Kingdom. Of course, Germany is in a transition. Olaf has just lost the election and they are putting together a government, and that government is not stable. There is not much they can say, save to say we are going to increase our defense spending. So the key leaders from Europe are France and the United Kingdom. The world is now waiting. What are the terms of the peace that they are presenting to the United States of America? And the next meeting that is going to take place, are we going to have initially a face-to-face meeting between the foreign minister of Russia and the foreign minister of Ukraine? Who is going to represent European Union or Europe or NATO? Is it going to be from the United Kingdom and France? And who are going to underwrite this? Is it the Americans? Will it be Mark Rubio? And once that has happened, will we have a face-to-face meeting between President Zelensky and President Putin? Will they do it in the presence of President Trump? And if they do it, are they going to shake hands? Is it going to be a staged process where you have stage one? Stage one, which means that we simply have a ceasefire, and then we deal with the medium-term issues, that issues relating to territory. The jury is still out, but the beauty of the current situation is that there is appetite for peace. Everybody appears to be fatigued. So the rhetoric may still remain, but I think underneath, the movement for peace is becoming stronger and stronger by the day. And remember, at one time, President Trump said that President Zelensky is a dictator who does not have the people's mandate because he has not gone through an election. Of course, that is neither here nor there. He can reply, but we are in the middle of war. We cannot change leadership at this time. But these are issues that are on the table. So when I look at my crystal ball, what do I see? I see a Europe that is going to recognize that in the short to medium term, you cannot toy around with the United States of America. Remember, the United States of America has already said, and the director of the CIA has said, that they are no longer going to share intelligence on Ukraine with NATO and with the United Kingdom. And that will create a black hole, because American intelligence gathering is one of the best in the world. And I believe that the Ukrainians relied upon it very heavily. And remember that the United States of America has indicated that we are not going to finance NATO. So every effort is going to be made by the Europeans to ensure that the Americans are on board. And that is all the reason why I say whatever we do, we shall pass it by the United States of America. And I think President Trump kind of likes that. And once that has happened, one hopes that we'll have a major peace conference. The Saudis have offered themselves as the place where this will be done. So I believe there could be a Saudi process when I look at the crystal ball. And I believe that in the next 2 or so months, we'll have something that is concrete, which people can put their teeth in. And one hopes that that will stabilize that region. But geopolitically and geostrategically, the Russians are not going to make certain concessions, and the Ukrainians are going to insist that those concessions be made. So it will be a very difficult peace process. But who said that that which is difficult cannot be resolved? That is what I see when I look at Russia and Ukraine fighting this war, which, with the help of hindsight, ought not to have been fought in the first place. The Ukraine-Russian war is also a war that has generated very interesting scenarios. And the scenarios have become a lot more obvious since the coming into power of Donald Trump. When Donald Trump came into power and said, we want peace by any means necessary, almost not in so many words, but effectively, Europe was almost angry. And when he said that he's no longer going to finance Europe or the United States of America, some of the statements that you heard from European leaders such as Ursula von der Leyen saying that the free world needs a new leader. Europe, in my view, still labors under the post-World War scenario, and particularly after the Cold War and the collapse of the Berlin Wall, where Europe sees itself as this region that is morally at the apex, whose duty it is to prescribe to the world what freedom means, what democracy means, and how they should behave. And you see that in France, President Macron, almost cocky at times. Keir Starmer, who is a new kid in the block, having become the prime minister not too long ago, but still sees himself as the overlord of this British Empire on which the sun never sets. And everybody is then projected as anti-freedom, as dictators. And Russia is seen in that context, that Russia, there is no freedom in Russia, there is no freedom in China, that the only part of the world that can bring about this freedom is Europe. So their motivation, or what their declared position is, we are fighting this war because we are fighting a Russia which is not a free part of the free world. And they are stopping countries which want to join the free world from joining the free world. They are not only stopping Ukraine, which is now the symbol of that struggle, but they are also stopping Georgia. So when you look at it from that standpoint, the motivation of these European powers is to ensure that a big power in Europe and a threat, which is a nuclear power in Europe, is neutralized. That, on the face of it, is the motivation of the Europeans. Zelensky, I believe, is a pawn in the political military chessboard, so that he may think that he is a very big wheel, but is merely a cog in that wheel. He has given Europe the opportunity to use the war as an excuse rather than a reason to propagate this free world thing. And he finds himself so deep in blood that to go forth is as tedious as to come back. So that his motivation, even when I try to look very closely, is unclear to me. What I hear him say is that we want to be part of Europe, we want to be part of NATO, because Russia is suffering from what they consider to be a hangover of wanting to dominate the former states of the Soviet Union. It is in that context that I understand him. Whether that is the dominant view in Ukraine is also debatable, because Ukraine is a home to very many native Russians. That is the reality in Donetsk and Luhansk, and that in places like Zaporizhzhia. It is also the reality in Crimea. So I see and sometimes sympathize with the position taken by Zelensky, who is a victim of things that he does not understand. The United States of America under Donald Trump is going through a process of reviewing her relationship. And I think Trump has been consistent. When he was Trump 45, the 45th president of the United States, he had actually said that Europe must pay the bills, that Americans are not going to pay the bills. And he is saying, as Trump 47, that position, which was disrupted when Biden became the 46th president of the United States, must now be dealt with. And he says that America, and he said in a very Trump-like style, that there is a big, beautiful ocean that divides us from Europe. In other words, he's saying, we are not going to allow ourselves to be saddled by things which are in your neighborhood. So the American motivation, as we have seen with the manner in which Trump dealt with Zelensky, is you've got to pay your bills. And we are told that there is rare earth in Ukraine. We want that rare earth because we need it. We need it because artificial intelligence and modern technology needs it. So going forward, it is quid pro quo. We are only going to support you if we have access to your minerals. You can see a very transactional President Trump who wants to ensure that Ukraine pays. And of course, the rest of the world is also looking. China, which is in the trading mode wants to have a world where they can sell their goods and their ware. And they would rather have peace in those spaces so that they can do what they think is good for China for the moment, to have a China that is trading, a China that is growing very quietly as an alternative power to the traditional powers being Europe, Russia, and of course the United States of America. So that is what one may characterize as the motivations. Of course, the jury is always out and many perspectives may emerge, but finally, I see a very frustrated Europe. A Europe that is frustrated at several levels. France, which considers itself to be the most important militarily in Europe now, is having its nose blooded by many African countries. They have been expelled from Senegal, expelled from La Côte d'Ivoire, expelled from Chad, expelled from Guinea, expelled from Mali, expelled from Niger, expelled from Guinea, from Burkina Faso. They are losing grip. And the United Kingdom, which is not so very united in its own right, is also discovering that having left the European Union, its leadership within Europe is also very tenuous and it may not be accepted. They are also using this opportunity to reassert themselves. Keir Starmer is not saying it in so many words, but in my view, even the decision to call this meeting in London was informed. Let us seize this opportunity and let us be seen to be taking the leadership after the Americans have gotten out, and we are the ones who are now providing the leadership. So everybody is playing their cards close to their chest, and it is not an easy time in the world, and one waits to see what will happen. I believe time is the revealer of all things, and in the fullness of time, it will become clear what these motivations are. You know, the Russian-Ukrainian war has also given birth to some statements which historians will find very useful as they write their books. One of the statements that has emerged from the London meeting is, we are prepared to put boots on the ground and to put planes in the air. But he qualified it almost immediately in the process of peace. I think Keir Starmer realized that that was a dangerous statement, so that he wants the world to understand that those boots on the ground and those planes in the air will be to safeguard peace. But I think what he actually meant is that they are prepared to go to war. And if they did that, and this is why President Trump was telling Zelensky, don't joke around, don't toy with a World War III. And he said it 3 times, warning him, let history not say that it is because of your stubbornness that we did not have peace, and that these European powers, namely to mean the United Kingdom and France, would then find a reason to be present. Because if that were to happen, I have no doubt in my mind that Russia would not hesitate to use their nuclear arsenal. And when that happens, Europe as we know it will go down, and go down very quickly, and it will take many years. And we must remind ourselves that the bombs and the nuclear arsenal that we are talking about today is not the type that was used in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It is a very different. This is a different kettle of fish. And I believe that that is a possibility, but I also believe that the appetite for a third world war, it does not exist. And particularly when the United States of America is out of the equation, Europe will think very carefully. But we must also remember that we are dealing with countries, particularly France and the United Kingdom, which have what I call a colonial hangover. They still believe that they should control the world, and they see that the control of the world is slipping through their fingers, and they are trying to reassert themselves. But it's not going to happen. There are new kids on the block. There is Russia, there is China, there is India, there is Brazil, and I believe that Africa is also going to begin to emerge, and of course, the ever-present United States of America. And I think messages are being sent very clearly, particularly to Macron, the president of France, and to Keir Starmer, who is the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Tone down. Tone down. The world has seen this. You are not there, or if you are there, you are not active participants. Don't have sharp appetite for conflict. And I hope that they are listening to the world, and they will listen and do that which is right. Sue for peace and persuade Zelensky to sue for peace. There are certain battles that are not worth fighting. This is the Trump message. Choose your battles carefully. And one of the battles not to fight now is to escalate the war between Ukraine and Russia, because we know what it is. It is a proxy war where Europe is fighting Russia. The Russian-Ukrainian war has really cost many balls to be in there. And it is brought about those balls in there because the scrutiny of the world is on existing institutions. And when we talk about the Ukrainian-Russian war, we must also not forget the Hamas-Israel war, to the extent that it has contributed. It has put scrutiny, contributed to this. It has put scrutiny, for example, on the United Nations. The United Nations has almost been impotent in the face of all these. Resolutions are brought in and then they are passed. Some of them are vetoed, and yet nobody listens to these statements that are coming from the United Nations. I sympathize with Antonio Guterres, moving from one meeting to the other, making this or that statement about this war, but nobody is listening. You see, in the International Court of Justice at The Hague, they make decisions which nobody even bothers about. So that going forward, one sees a number of things in terms of the existing post-World War II institutions. Let's look at NATO. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, was an organization that was put together and became an organization that was used by the Western world to mean Europe as we know it and the United States of America to be a body that would guard the member states against the Soviet Union at that time. It is in that context that we must also see the Warsaw Pact that brought together the nations that were inclined to the Soviet Union, so that there was a justification. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, at one time there was even a thought that Russia would be a part of NATO. But we have seen that change very dramatically, with the consequence that within NATO itself, the big underwriter of NATO, being the United States of America, is now saying, we've been looking after you for too long, we've been paying the bill for too long, and therefore we think that the time is now for you to pay the bills. And this is coming at a time when the non-traditional European countries also want to join NATO. And that is the context in which Ukraine thought that in order to immunize themselves against the power of Russia, let us join NATO. But the situation has changed also. The Americans are saying, really, why should we be in NATO at all? Does it benefit us? And if we are in talking terms and we can forge an alliance with Russia, then why? Why should we even bother to be part of NATO? And here the Russians say, we are willing to even help the United States of America to negotiate with Iran regarding their nuclear arsenal. If that happens, the continued stay of the United States of America in NATO is something that may become very shaky. So never say never. NATO may find itself with its membership reducing. Germany, after the post-war in their pacifist constitution, also restricted their defense budget they are now beginning to say that we must look after ourselves. Once they acquire the ability to look after themselves, would they want to stay in NATO? Remember also, the United Kingdom got out of the European Union. If they continue to be outside of the European Union, will the continental European countries be comfortable with them in NATO? So there are too many moving parts in that regard. And the parts are moving in such a manner that if the Trump presidency continues on the same trajectory, we may have a totally different reorganization within Western Europe, which then brings us to the United Nations. You know, prior to the coming into being of the United Nations in San Francisco in 1945, we had the League of Nations. And the League of Nations, having been created after the World War I, was discovered to have lost its value. I am almost taking the view that the UN must also be reorganized. The time is now. 80 years after the Second World War, the UN must be re-examined. Is it effective? Is it the body that was created in 1945 in San Francisco? Are institutions effective? Or the time is now for the world to rethink the UN and to re-energize it in a different way. That debate is one that I think is alive now. The African countries are also saying we've been part of this movement, but we have never enjoyed status as permanent members. And within the African Union, I always wonder when they talk about the 2 seats, is it going to, are they going to be divided? Are you going to tell the Maghreb, choose one so that Egypt becomes a permanent member? When you come to sub-Saharan Africa, are you going to choose Nigeria or South Africa? So these are issues which are coming into the play, and I see a world which is born out of the conflict in Ukraine and the conflict in between Israel and Hamas, which is going to reorder herself. The only issue, of course, is that the term of a US president is very short, 4 years, and some of these things may not be concluded during that period, but things have started moving in earnest, and who knows, they may move so fast, so quickly, before we know it, things will have changed and changed dramatically. In other words, what one sees is a very interesting scenario going forward. The next 4 years are going to be historic.
In the comments below. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the African Web for more eye-opening stories that matter. Like, comment, and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Until next time, stay informed, stay engaged,